Hi, thanks. I had no, that totally got lost in translation. I thought you meant like good to host it, lead it on your own. But I've never gotten into any of those accounts, so I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. Yeah, I haven't gotten into any of those accounts ever. So I thought when you said host in the thread, I was like, oh yeah, I can lead it, or I don't need any assistance with that, but I didn't. Anyway, we're here. You can make me the host and then log off, but
Yep, I got you. All right, you're the host. You should have screen sharing permissions, and I'm still in the office and I'll be here for a couple hours, so I'll be off, but like here if you need anything.
okay. Hi there, folks. We're just getting people into the Zoom. We had a little bit of a tech tangle on our end, so we're a few minutes late getting that on, but we're just getting some people in out of the waiting room here, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. Hi there. We've only got 3 folks in, so I'm not sure. Maybe the delay in getting the meeting started. Maybe I know like 15 or so RSVP'd for this, so we'll just give it another couple minutes here. I'm gonna go on mute and close a door on the other side here, but we'll start in just a couple minutes. Um, okay, folks, I think what I'm going to go ahead and start in here. This is going to be recorded, and it's possible that some of the folks who RSVP'd are either going to join a little bit later on or watch for the recording. They're going to miss out on the Q&A, of course, but so I'm just going to go ahead and run through this, run into it, so I can respect everybody else's time here. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for your interest in fruit trees and berries in the Front Range here. I know or have met almost everybody on this call, I think, except for Melissa. I think we met Stephen. Anyway, Josh, Jerry, good to see you here. And I'm going to share my screen and kind of go through, there's some visuals and some text aids here. Feel free to, at any point, drop something into the chat. I may or may not be able to see it right away if I'm switching slides and things like that. But also feel free to unmute. We have such a small group. Feel free to unmute at any time and just interrupt me with a question. That's not a problem in a group like this. So
you know, I got questions, homie.
yeah, I know. I
Bless
know, I
you.
actually have an email from you, Josh, that I haven't responded to. I saw
Well,
it.
that
Oh
was
yeah.
kind of what I would just love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll don't
Okay.
even yeah. No, we'll um so this is going to be an overall presentation and then a oops that's the wrong button entirely. And then an overall kind of background here. We'll have a little bit of a chance for Q&A later on. So my name is Creighton Hoffitz. I am the Director of Permaculture and Perennials at Denver Urban Gardens. And for the last few years, we've done more and more perennial plant sales as part of Doug, as we kind of increase our food forest program and do a lot more with perennials in general. So this is intended to kind of give you a better set of tools for looking at a particular space, thinking about where you should site and plant things, because if they're going to be there for a few decades, you really want to be able to know that they're in the right place. So if you are not familiar, Denver Urban Gardens has an over 40-year history in different iterations and incarnations, and we have over 200 gardens and food forests across 6 counties. Um, and yeah, we do growing in community in all kinds of ways. And our mission is to provide the access, skills, and resources for people to grow healthy food in community and regenerate urban green spaces. And so our education programs are a big part of this. Also, before we really go any further, I want to acknowledge that we are all of us on the unceded territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and Oceti-Sakowin. And the land where we are has historically been a convergence and confluence point for over 48 other tribes. And it's important to us to think about stewardship, collective liberation, and what all of our collective obligations are to the original stewards of the land. So in Colorado, we're going to start with the Colorado climate, because why do we choose certain plants over others here, and what things do we have to be aware of? Now, some of this might be sort of review, but I find it really helpful to ground ourselves in some of these particulars. We have what's called a continental climate, which means we're far away from the moderating influences of bodies of water. We're also very high in elevation. So the combination of those things means we have a really wide variation of temperatures, and we can have big swings very quickly. You don't have quite the same heat spikes or drops into cold weather in places that are close to large bodies of water. Also, when we get precipitation, a lot of times it happens in big events rather than slow, steady drizzles. And these areas of the world that I list here are known as climate analogs. So if you think about what's grown in those areas, how they grow what they grow there, and kind of the practices, we can kind of transpose some of that to Colorado. And sometimes particular plant species as well, as we'll get to. You may or may not be familiar with plant hardiness, but this is another big tool to be aware of when we're choosing perennial plants. And I'm not totally sure if I have the newest updated map in this slideshow now that I think about it, because they just updated the zone for the Denver area this past winter. But hardiness refers to the minimum temperature it gets to. So what's the coldest it gets to on a 30-year average? You'll notice in this one is from 1976 to 2005. So there is a rolling reassessment of 30-year averages. That means it can get colder than that. Usually it doesn't. And so in Colorado, we have this kind of variation around Denver and up into Boulder, this chunk of the Front Range. We are either a 5B or a 6A. And you can see that a 5B can get down to -15, whereas a 6A is only to -10 in Fahrenheit. Now, a couple of winters ago, some places in Denver recorded -18. So that would be down in 5A. And so, the 30-year average can be a little bit misleading, but in general, we are warming. So that does mean that, we know that we're going to continue to warm. And even though there's climate instability, we know that overall, in 40 or 50 years, we'll be able to grow certain perennials here that we didn't used to, because the winters will not be as cold. And that is something that I don't like, but it is something that we need to plan for and think about, and we can adapt to. So then zooming in a little bit in the Front Range, as opposed to other parts of Colorado, we have these late spring frosts. We have hail that's possible throughout the growing season, and we have some really high winds. Those have been on display the last week or so. And so we have some pretty intense conditions here. And those late spring frosts are a huge one for fruit trees, and it's something that people are aware of, but don't necessarily plan for. And so if you don't take anything else away from what I'm talking about here tonight, I want you to think about how to mitigate the effect of late spring frosts in where you place your fruit trees. And this is a chart from Michigan State University. They have this for all of the different fruit trees, but as a tree starts to break bud, from the silver tip to the green tip, and then all the way into full bloom, the cold hardiness of those blossoms and of the branch, of the blossoms, it actually decreases, right? So you'll see that that apple on the top row, just to interpret this chart, when the buds start to expand early in the spring, say in March or at some point, you can see a change in the branch, but if it's that silver tip, you're only going to get 10% of the buds are going to be killed at 15 degrees. So it actually takes a really hard freeze to kill these early stages. But by the time you get to the tight cluster, then we're looking at 27 to 28, right? So you'll notice it doesn't say 32, which means it can graze 32 and your blossoms are going to be okay. But if it gets below that, it will kill the blossoms, and we get these late frosts after the tree has bloomed. We get snaps back down, kills the blossoms, and then the tree doesn't fruit, right? So that's one of our biggest challenges when it comes to our fruit tree cultivation here in the Front Range. It is also a reason that people tend to think that it's not worth it, and I'm here to tell you that it is. There's a long history of cultivated fruit tree production along the Front Range. It's just a matter of adapting and planning in certain ways. I got a question in the chat about these slides, and this whole presentation will be recorded, so you'll be able to access that. So the urban context, right, is that within the Front Range, it's a little bit different here than it might be, somewhere in between Boulder and Denver, where you don't have as concentrated an area like maybe parts of, around Louisville and places like that. You get pretty rural, but Front Range, but in the urban context, we have even more heat because of the buildings and the roads here, holding on to that heat and their thermal mass. And there's also a huge amount of diversity because people, there's the botanic gardens, of course, but also people like to plant all kinds of different things in their yards, which means that you kind of have this cities can represent a kind of botanical arc of lots of different kinds of stuff if you know where to look. Of course, that can also mean more vectors for disease, for plants that don't play nice with others, things like that. But then I also hear the other big thing that I encourage you to think about is runoff. So when we get those big precipitation events, having a lot of roofs and roads and sidewalks means that we're actually can vastly increase the amount of functional precipitation. Because if you have, a 100 square foot area of land next to a 100 square foot roof area, if you put all the rainwater and snow melt that goes onto that roof, if you put that onto the landscape, you're basically doubling the amount of precipitation in a year. Whoops, there's a typo in this slide. It says any plant can be grown as an annual, but that means any plant. So you can grow a lot of plants as an annual that are grown as perennials in other climates. Tomatoes are actually a great example of this. There's a variety of spices and herbs and things that that we can grow here in one season and get a bit of a harvest, but they won't come back. But with perennials, right, we're in a situation where we want them to survive every winter. And then the other kind of difference here is that with annuals, you got to water them all the time. But perennials can survive really long drought periods, months and months after establishment. But that also means that, surviving is different than thriving and fruiting. And really, if you want to have significant fruit production or nut production, you need to have a good amount of water. And again, that can be irrigation, but it can also be passive strategies, like I mentioned with stormwater runoff. So, all right, we're thinking then about like, what do we do on our site? What do we look for here on the site in order to determine, because there's lots of information that you can gather, but not all of it is relevant. So these kind of four main conditions I want you to think about is, where is it exposed and where is it shady? Where's the water going? Where are the buildings? And where is the access? So where do you go most often? Where do you go rarely? And this overlaps with this idea of patterns of use, right? The only other thing that I might add to this that I could have listed would be landform, so slopes, right? So thinking about what direction, do you have a slope that faces south or west? I have a west facing slope in front of my house, which means that in the evening as the sun goes down, that's actually really hot and exposed, and the western slopes are often quite dry and hot, whereas the northern slopes or northern sides of buildings tend to be cooler. And our kind of general recommendations here, we don't want to put our trees in a place where they're going to shade out gardens, where we could grow other food. I actually recommend putting them in sort of out of the way locations. You will interact with a fruit tree a few times a year, but you're not doing it every day. So don't put it, right out your back porch. And then find cool microclimates. So I said, especially for peach and Asian pear, we'll talk a bit about species, but different fruit trees bloom earlier or later. And the earlier it blooms, the colder you want to keep it. Right, to avoid those late spring frosts, we want to delay bloom time. So if you've got a peach, it blooms earlier than apples and pears. You want to put that in a cold location. So my favorite thing is in a snowstorm in March or April. Where does the snow stick around a day or two later? Those are the spots where you should put your fruit trees. Wherever the snow is sticking around unusually long, that's a prime fruit tree spot. So this is a map of the conditions at my house that I did 5 years ago now. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. This might look kind of overwhelming, but this is something from permaculture design called sector analysis, where you're kind of looking at all the different forces and flows on your site. And you'll notice here the ones to really pay attention to here are the kind of hot arrows. Those are exposed areas where I know that there's a lot more sun, there's a lot more heat coming through. And then there's some shaded gray areas where I know that's always shady. There's existing trees and things like that. But there's also a band of shade along the northern edge of the house there. Right, so you can kind of make it visual for yourself. You can certainly write it down, you can do this, but I recommend doing some kind of simple map and making it visual for yourself so that you can really evoke the different feelings and conditions of your yard, as opposed to thinking about your yard as like a, or any site that you're working with, just like an open rectangle or just like a space there. Where are the places that you're drawn to and not, and the hot and cool, there are, we want to really hone in on those different conditions. And then this is known as zones of use or patterns of use. So in this case, 1 is the most intense use, 2 is a little bit less, and 3 is even less than that. And then it goes up to 4 and 5. And we don't need to get into the full framework of zones of use design. But what's important here is that you go really often in some areas, and you hardly ever go to other places. So for fruit trees, we're thinking, okay, where do I go a little bit less often? I still want to be able to get there, but I'm not interacting with this every single day. So you're looking, zone 2, 3, or 4 for fruit trees. Now, berries might be a little bit different. Berry bushes can be a good thing to put along a walking path, because once your berries are fruiting, maybe you're walking off to work in the morning and you have a row of berry bushes planted and you can just grab a couple berries on your way, right? That might be a slightly different situation than fruit trees. Okay, this is also, again, super overwhelming if you haven't been introduced to this framework, but I want to put it out there that you can put these things together, right? So we're kind of, and you can do this by writing as well. You can represent this in whatever way you want. But if I'm thinking about, okay, where do I go not super often that has a cool microclimate and maybe has some extra water flow? I've added some areas for passive water flow. Well, you'll see this area to the north of the house. It's got a little bit more cooler area. I don't go there all the time. And this area is where all of my fruit trees are planted, or most of my fruit trees are planted. I also planted a number of them along the northern side of my southern fence. So there's actually a little bit of that area there where they still get sun, but the fence creates a microclimate where they're pretty shaded for a long time in the spring. Okay, before I switch off of this slide and go to the stuff, because it's been a lot, I just want to pause. Are there any questions or thoughts about this framework or the general thing we're talking about with fruit trees? I know I'm going relatively speedily through this, but I don't want to get too bogged down. But yeah, any questions or thoughts so far?
I think most of this makes sense. Great. And I think my curiosity is around, yeah, certain species, and you touched on it there with the berries and the different types. So I'm assuming you're going to get to that and connect it back to this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're gonna. I wanted to kind of talk about frameworks of how we look at overall situation, and then look at a few different species and where do they fit into this in different places.
Perfect.
Yeah. Melissa's asking if there are online templates or tools. I don't actually know about online templates. There's all kinds of online imaging tools and different kind of graphic aids that you can use for this. You can use things like SketchUp, which is a modeling software for, you can create like a floor plan. You can probably even use things as simple as Canva, which is a kind of an image editing software that you can do different things if you wanted to, and could probably do overlays. Or even honestly, like take a screenshot on your phone of the Google image, the Google map of your site, and then just kind of like draw on it a little bit. But I don't know of any other good templates that would walk you through this particular thing. So I think use the tools that you like. Some people really like doing it by hand. Some people like digital stuff. All right. So when I'm thinking about species, native versus adapted, I am not a big native plant advocate. That doesn't mean I think we need to have lots of native plants in our landscapes. And I think that especially in park landscaping, in our kind of wilder areas, we really need to emphasize repairing our ecology. And most of the plants that you're getting food from are not native, not indigenous to Colorado or North America, and they're domesticated, right? So the apples that you eat or the nuts that you eat, all these plants have been selected for greater productivity and better interactions with kind of cultivated domestic process. So so I look for adapted plants that they can thrive here. And in our food forests at Doug, we use a few native plants, but I'm really about intensively producing lots of food in an urban area to feed people. And that just means non-native plants in our region. There's no way around that. And I also think, we have a lot of hybridization in our society, in our world. And I think when we think about climate resilience and planning for the future, we have to be more flexible with that. That is my own personal opinion. There are plenty of really wonderful native foods and fruit trees and berry bushes, more berry bushes here than fruit trees. But that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of this, my process. These are kind of some of the main fruit trees that we plant here. So we do apple, pear, plum, tart cherries, Asian pears as well, peaches. There's a hybrid Asian American persimmon that we're experimenting with, jujube, mulberries, and hazelnuts. So a couple notes here, and you can kind of see the different notes that are on the slides, but I really want to emphasize for apples and pears, you got to find something that's fire blight resistant. We sell fruit trees that are fire blight resistant at Doug, and I select for those. Mostly I'm getting them from out-of-state nurseries because somehow local nurseries really have not caught up to carrying fire blight resistant apples, and they'll carry stuff like a red delicious apple because people know what it is. People plant that red delicious apple. Fire blight is a virus, and it's all over the place in the urban areas. It infects your red delicious tree, it kills it in a couple of years, and then people think, oh, apples aren't worthwhile. And they really are. They're probably still the most versatile and worthwhile fruit that we can grow. Apples are very like basic in some ways, but they are wonderful. You just got to pick the right stuff. So apples and pears, look for that, for fire blight resistance. And you can find lists of that online. If you're at a nursery and you're not sure, just Google it while you're there. Plums can do really well here because they don't have as many fungal diseases. And then, yeah, we don't really grow sweet cherries very well, like Rainier, but tart cherries like Bali and Montmorency, tart cherry or sour cherry isn't as good a marketing term as pie cherries. But those are the different words that you'll find those under. Jujubes are a one that we're planting in our food forest now, and we are excited about. They would not have been hardy in Colorado, a few decades ago, but we can plant them here. They're from northern China, Mongolia, so that climate analog, and they also are a really good way, I think, to connect with our immigrant cultures here in Denver. Mulberries, they can be messy, but they fruit really quickly. And if you're eating them, they're not messy. But don't plant a mulberry over a driveway because they drop the berries and stains everything purple.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
I can remember you talking about it. Could you explain again why sweet cherries don't do well here compared to tart cherries, and then also with the jujube? Is the reason that we can grow it now because our climate has changed?
Yeah, so jujubes usually they need like about a zone 6 to survive the winter. I've seen them listed at some a little bit colder than that, but we used to be zone 4 or 5 around the Denver metro area. Now we're high 5, low 6, and so especially in the right kind of warm microclimate, jujubes do fine. And these are there are jujubes growing at the Denver Botanic Gardens, actually. And then so sweet cherries, they can do okay. They tend to blossom really early, and then they also need just like a slightly shifted season. A lot of the sweet cherry production comes out of places that have a slightly more moderate climate than us, and I just have never seen them do very well. And I see the trees die quite a bit here. And then what was I gonna say? Oh, so yeah, then so if we're talking about the hazelnuts, those are the main ones that we plant at Doug Food Forest. Walnuts and black walnuts also grow in Colorado, and they fruit. I actually have a black walnut tree in my backyard, fruits every year, and it's great. But they get so big that we don't plant them in Doug Food Forest because they get 60, 70 feet eventually. So it's not a little bit incompatible with our growing spaces, but those are totally fine if you have the space to plant walnuts here. They're vulnerable to some diseases, but they do fine. So if I'm thinking about an exposed area, like maybe a western slope or a southern area that's going to be more exposed, I'm going to plant things like jujubes, mulberries, hazelnuts, and then maybe apples, because apples and pears are both later bloomers, so they'll still be better if they get that delayed bloom, but those are the ones I'm looking for. If I have access to a north-facing slope, a little bit of that cooler microclimate that delays the bloom time, then I'm looking for Asian pears, peaches, plums, pie cherries, but mulberries especially, like they don't fruit in the same way, so they're totally resistant to spring freezes. Jujubes fruit, like they only bloom in July, like very, very late blooming. And hazelnuts have a different production process as well. Question in the chat about pecans. Pecans need a longer season than we have. So pecans can grow. The actual tree can grow and survive here in Colorado, but the nuts never ripen. So it'll even set nuts. I've heard about that where the pecans will do that, but the nuts need a longer season than we have. So you need to go a little bit farther south or farther east into the Midwest where there's some moderating climate influences so that you can, here our frost-free zone is like end of April to beginning of October. You probably need like beginning of April to end of October, like an extra month and a half for pecans to do it. And so pecans are another one that might become viable in the next several decades. Another one, by the way, is pistachio. In parts of Utah that have the moderating influence of the Great Salt Lake and other climate influences there, you actually can grow pistachios. So I'm on the lookout for that as our climate changes, is when pistachios become viable here.
Great.
So,
And are any of these trees suitable for containers, like large containers?
sure, I think you can. I've seen yeah, all of these would adapt to that. I would say go as large as you can, like large containers. I would say probably the easiest one to adapt to that would be a pie cherry. That's a smaller tree in general. And so
Would it
you,
also be about like choosing? I remember we were talking during our class about choosing a weaker stock. You'd kind of
yeah,
mention.
you can get dwarfing rootstocks and things like that. But yeah, you can get dwarfing rootstocks. You can hear the hesitation in my voice. I think I've seen them, but I've seen like I'm talking like 3 square feet, 3 feet on a side, kind of containers, like big box containers I've seen fruit trees in. It's just you can do it, but I think you should look at other kinds of food if you're bound to containers.
Sure.
That's what I'd recommend. And I saw a question about what fruit trees might become viable as the climate changes. Persimmon is one. Persimmons, we have this hybrid one. So native North American persimmons can live here, but they get really big and the fruit's very small. Asian persimmons could become viable here as the climate continues to change. And I don't know, even certain types of hardy citrus could become more viable here. And we can grow hardy figs in our climate, but they have a different growth cycle. They always die back to the ground. So we don't want them. So they're kind of tree-like, they're more shrubby-like. But as the climate changes, probably figs would be another one that will become more and more viable in terms of surviving the winter. But the trick here, the problem, of course, is that even if the climate, and this is the problem with climate chaos that we'll deal with, is that even if the average winter is warmer, we'll have more instability where it could get just as cold as it used to get. So you might plant a fig or an Asian persimmon or whatever, and then you might be fine for 5 or 6 years, and then you have a really cold winter again that would kill them. So that's going to be part of the world that we keep living in. So I wanted to look at a little bit of the berries that we use here. This is a list of some of the main berries that we're planting. The first three are all the same plant genus, ribes, R-I-B-E-S. And so the currant, yostaberry, and gooseberry, they're all ribes. They're kind of different, right? So, and they all do great here in both full sun and part shade. So like the currant has small berries, a few different kinds, black currants, red currants, white currants, pink currants, and they get about 4 to 6 feet. Then yostaberries have slightly bigger berries that they're kind of a cross. Gooseberries have really big berries, marble size, delicious berries, but they're really thorny. So, you know, depending on where you want them, you might not want gooseberries right on your pathway because they'll reach out and be kind of brambly. Honeyberries are a great plant for shady areas. They actually get kind of burned in full sun here. So if you have an area that already has an established overstory of tree, you can put a honeyberry underneath that in kind of part sun, and that can be really useful. Bush cherries, they're basically a bushing version of a pie cherry. So they kind of shrub multi-stem instead of being just one tree. They're awesome. They grow really fast. They bear early. They've been really successful here and in other places in our kind of urban orchard network nationally. They're a new kind of agricultural product. And then elderberries, serviceberries, aronia, those are all a little bit more wild. They're a little bit larger. There is a native elderberry, but the European one is the one that's really highly medicinal that you see elderberry syrups made out of. Grows really fast, multi-stem. The serviceberry is basically our region's equivalent to a blueberry. We can't grow blueberries here because of the soil pH. We have really alkaline soils, and blueberries need acidic soil. But serviceberries are fantastic. This is probably the main local native plant that we plant in our food forest. Lots of different uses. And then aronias, they like this is like the most, the highest antioxidants of any berry. They can be a pretty large shrub, like a 6 to 8 foot tall and wide. Beautiful fall foliage and this like really dark purple berry. It's pretty astringent unless you turn it into syrups and jams. And yep, thornless blackberries. So there's lots of selected varieties that don't have thorns and still produce really well. And so blackberries can do great here. You might notice I don't have raspberries or strawberries on here. Those are great in a home garden, but we don't put those in our food forest because raspberries spread really easily. They send runners out, and so you'll get this kind of out of control patch. And so you have to kind of set it up ahead of time or know that you're really going to take care of it with pruning. And then strawberries work well in a variety of contexts next to the garden, but they're not a woody perennial. So we do include them some, and they would work fine too as well. Blueberries do not work under a large pine tree. Shoshana is asking about that. The pine needles acidify the soil, but not enough. And so it just doesn't do that. Don't plant blueberries here, please. Just please do not plant blueberries because I've seen it successful when people put like peat moss bales of peat moss that's mined from Scotland or Russia and brought here and put that in the ground and then plant the blueberry but you're working so hard against the natural soil conditions. I've also seen people water with like apple cider vinegar dilutions, right? So none of that's a really good solution, especially when we have something like a serviceberry. Also, I just wanted to let everybody know I am having to move locations briefly because I just realized I did not plug my computer in. So it should be just fine. I'm going to keep talking and keep going. But if there's any glitch in the feed here, that might be the reason why, or in any of the sounds. But I just have to go and get my charger cables because I didn't really prepare super well for this. All right, companion plants. So we've moved along here. These are some of the main ones that we'll use. And the top 5 here, on the first 5, on this list, they're all nitrogen fixers of different sizes. Some are native, some are not, but nitrogen fixing plants is a great way to add diversity, provide pollinator habitat, and also feed the soil so that your main fruiting plants can grow more quickly. So we usually put those, 3 to 4 feet away from our major fruit trees there. I would say pea shrub, buffalo berry, false indigo, and lead plant are all fine really close in. New Mexico locust gets a lot larger. It's more like a tree, so I wouldn't plant it too close to other things. Like you're maybe give it more like a 10 or 12-foot spacing because of how big it gets. And then these other plants here are herbaceous perennials, so they'll die back to the ground every winter. Comfrey is fantastic. Whoops, didn't mean to advance. Comfrey is fantastic as it sort of mines nutrients out of the soil. It smothers and suppresses weeds, highly medicinal. Comfrey is a really awesome thing that you can plant right around the base of your fruit trees. Ditto for horseradish, actually, because it has an edible root. And this perennial broccoli, also known as Turkish rocket. There's some of these plants that you can put around the base of the fruit tree and in between your berries as well. Rhubarb needs a little bit more sun to be truly effective, and so does lovage. But man, lovage also hosts lots of beneficial insects and is great in stews. You could also go on and on and on with this list of other companion plants. But I put this in here because I think it's really helpful to almost never plant in isolation. So we can keep thinking about, well, what else do we put around this to support? And if you're going to be adding water in our climate to the fruit tree, well, maybe just add water to that whole area and plant a bunch of other stuff right around it, because then you'll get extra productivity from that area. Any questions so far about the plant list? Anything that came up as people are looking at that?
Great. And this is just kind of more, I know in your front yard you have your your hellscape near the street, you have the cut in. But when you were doing some of that stuff, were you getting the city to come out and tell you where gas lines were? I mean,
so if you're digging if you're digging at any significant depth, you want to do an 811 locate. And I would just say also this is a public workshop that we're doing here. And I know that you've been to my house, Josh, but this is a public workshop that's going to be posted on our website, and I don't want to comment about anything else.
Sounds good.
So just talking a little bit about spacing. So we'll get more into this rootstock thing with some graphics in a moment. Standard size fruit trees, especially apples and pears, can get huge. They can get 30 feet, 35 feet. And so you got to think about that and what you're going to do in time with that. If you get a smaller rootstock that's less vigorous. Josh was mentioning this in a question earlier. You can find stuff at nurseries that say it's a dwarf rootstock. So that means it'll be smaller than normal. I think my next slide actually has this, so I'm just going to quickly look at that. Right. So you might have on the right here a standard size, and then you have all these different rootstocks that are bred in nurseries and things around the country, around the world, that are trying to get a smaller percentage, because then they do bear fruit more quickly and you can pack them in a little bit. But the problem is that in order to get this, like this EMLA 9, for instance, it's 40%. They basically planted a bunch of trees and then they chose the smallest ones, and then they got the fruit from that, and they kept going like that. So keep getting like the smallest ones and the smallest ones and the smallest ones. So you actually have a weaker plant. And that's not great for our clay soils or our high winds. So, oops, can I go back? What I recommend is, if you can, get the standard size, and then you can control it with pruning. So maybe 10, 15 years down the line, you can do a summer pruning of a tree, which kind of shocks it and keeps it small. But that also makes it easier for harvesting. So we plant at 15-foot spacing for our fruit trees. That looks pretty I've also done 12-foot spacing. Honestly, in my own landscape, I've done something like 9 or 10-foot spacing, but that's because I know I'm going to be around to do lots of really exact pruning with it. So I would give at least 12 to 15 feet between each of your kind of standard fruit trees. Again, tart cherries, hazelnuts are a little bit smaller, and hazelnuts are more like they usually grow more like a hedge, like a shrub, rather than a tree. But yeah, so, and you'll see these rootstocks listed on nurseries. You'll see these terms like standard, semi-standard, semi-dwarf, dwarf, and that's kind of in order from largest to smallest. But this is just this is one of our food forests in Aurora here. And you can see this is kind of like my plan where I'm putting out a whole bunch of different sizes. The largest circles are 15 feet across. And then these smaller circles up to the right, you can see it says cherries. And then bush, those are 10 feet across. And then the cherries are like, or sorry, they're 12 feet across, I think, in this. So 12-foot spacing. And then these bush cherries and the other berries, we're putting it like 6-foot spacing. And down here to the lower left, you're seeing the hazelnuts. Those are on, 8-foot spacing. So this is what I'm often doing when I'm thinking, well, how much can a certain area contain? Now, I'll also say that within each of these areas, so within each of one of these 15-foot circles, I'm also going to include a nitrogen fixing plant, other berry bushes, companion plants. So in each one of these circles, you could have, 7 or 8 other plants contributing in and around that fruit tree. Okay, so pollination and disease. People are always asking about pollination. Does this need 2 varieties? So what's cool is that even though an apple needs a different variety to pollinate it and to produce fruit. So if I have my Honeycrisp apple, or I'll change variety to my Empire apple, which is a fire blight resistant. So if I have my Empire apple, if I plant 3 Empire apples in my backyard, they're not necessarily going to fruit. They need a different variety around in order to cross-pollinate and actually be productive. But the fact is that like you go down the street, somebody's got a crab apple, an apple, they've got something else. And so it's for apples and pears, even cherries and plums in the urban environment, there's enough of that around that our pollinators can go between them, and you're usually going to be okay with just having one variety. Now, if you have 2 varieties close to each other, that's even better because then you know that you're going to get a better coverage of the blossoms and better production. And you'll see self-fertile listed, and that's true, but even so, they're going to be more productive, right? So I've listed that there. And then, yeah, this cool stuff, right? Like, so plant hazelnuts in groves because they need to be wind pollinated. So they actually, if you have 2 hazelnuts, but they're 50 feet apart, it won't matter. They won't get pollinated because there isn't an insect that's carrying the pollen between them. So I often plant them in groves of, between 3 and 7 or 8 hazelnuts at our food forests. And those jujubes need to be right next to each other because ants actually pollinate them. They go up and down the trunk from tree to tree, right? So thinking about those interactions is also important. And then, yeah, so this other thing about disease, especially with fire blight, but there are some others as well, like cytospora canker in peaches and some things. It's just all around here. So it's much better to control with resistant varieties and pruning than to try and imagine that you're going to actually escape fire blight in Denver. This is something you don't need to pay too much attention to other than to know that it exists. If you're going to nurseries and you're looking, especially at a place where they might have a ton of varieties, they're going to say this pollination chart where, you can see there's the Honeycrisp and it's like, what does it pollinate with? What is it compatible with? This is based on bloom time. So if you have a really early bloomer next to a late bloomer, in this case, say like this Dorset Golden, right, which is up here, and then some of these ones on the right, I guess it's more alphabetized than thing, but it's then by time, but they're not necessarily going to overlap in when they're blooming, so they won't get pollinated by each other. Everything that we do at Doug for sourcing is meant to reduce maintenance and to be more kind of robust to disease and pollination. So I only select mid-season apples, so they're like right in the middle, so they're definitely going to overlap, and then they are then they're fire blight resistant. Shoshana, thank you for asking this question because I actually misspoke in terms of apples pollinating with crab apples. Usually crab apples bloom significantly earlier than apples, so they often don't pollinate each other. I said crab apples, but I shouldn't have said that. Sometimes they can overlap if it's just right, but I wouldn't assume that the crab apple would pollinate the apple. Oh. So let's get to questions, more specific questions here. And so this is one of our education events. Just want to also shout out our community education sponsor, Delta Dental, which makes these possible and free. But you can certainly follow up by emailing me at creighton@doug.org, and you can email our events manager about this and other workshops at caroline@doug.org. But yeah, I just want to throw it open then for specific questions, particular context, things about the species that you saw in this presentation. Nick says, after how long or after what point would you cull or replace a newly planted tree or bush? Like if it's not doing well? That's a good question. It depends, I guess. It's an easy out. I think you're gonna have transplant shock. So in the first year, when you plant something, you're usually not gonna see a lot of new growth. So it can look like it's not doing well, and then 2 or 3 years in, they can really leap. I think there's a saying about perennials is that they are what is it? The first year it's like sleep, creep, and then leap. So in the third year, you start to see them really, once they've established that full root system, they start to grow more and more. You also have to think about how they're not doing well. If you see signs of disease or infection on a small tree, like if it's a young pear or apple that has fire blight, it's not going to survive it. If it's like a newly planted one that got fire blight, it's not going to survive it generally, and I would remove it so that it doesn't infect other things in the landscape. But then I think on the other thing about this is that like some plants will sprout from the base, like hazelnuts sprout right from the base, even if the top of it doesn't look good. So you might wait a little bit, and then maybe the top dies, but then it just takes a couple of years for everything to really sprout and be fine. I've seen that happen quite a bit. But other, like an apple tree, because of the grafting, you don't want it to be sprouting from the base. You want to look to the top. There's just like a lot of very particular things there, but I would give it probably more time than you'd think, because of all of the because of just like the long term of perennials, and because when you plant them, you basically need, how should I say, like you're doing a long-term thing when you plant a tree. And so you're actually losing the opportunity cost of that first transplant shock. You got to start again from the beginning. So, see if they can rebound. I agree so also there's questions in the chat about sourcing. Definitely, I also recommend Harlequin's Gardens. They have some good fruit trees, but they still don't have a great selection of apples or pears for fire blight resistance. They have some okay tart cherries and plums and peaches, but they don't have as wide a variety of the domesticated fruit trees because of their focus is on like really hardy natives. But I love Harlequins. We source a bunch of stuff from them as well. And I do certainly recommend Doug for the, that's my thing is the fruit tree sales. We also have, we have our plant sale coming up this weekend on Friday and Saturday, May 10th and 11th, where we're selling all the plants that you just saw, unless we're sold out of them. And you can get to you can actually do pre-order of plants on the website right now. They're all coming bare root for planting in the spring. So a little bit more about fire blight. I would just, I would Google fire blight, and it's better than me describing it here. But it's kind of a shepherd's crook, and the leaves look sort of burned. It shows up usually in late May or June. And then there are some chemical cures for fire blight. There's no organic cure. There's like copper sprays and things like that. For prevention, it's just really seeing it early. So you can prune it out once it's there. So it attacks the blossoms first and then moves to the tips of the branches and starts to work back. So if you see that, you can actually prune sort of behind the infection and remove it. That's what I do primarily, because I don't kind of want to wade into the whole thing about chemical sprays and reapplications and possible negative consequences for the rest of the landscape. Good resources for them to learn how to prune. Take my pruning workshop next year in March. There's a lot of different good videos on pruning. I don't know. It's hard to say that, and there are some good pruning books, and I don't know that I recommend one particular. Well, I will say that there's the backyard, or here, I'll put this in here. The Backyard Orchardist by Stella Otto. I like that one. Oops, I sent that to the wrong thing. I'm gonna say this is a good one for a book pruning resource. But I'd say don't be afraid to cut. With apples, you need to take off half the blooms. Well, you prune before it blooms, so you only want to prune up to like kind of the beginning of April when the trees are still dormant. But I will say here that for the first 3 years, we recommend it, Doug, that you actually remove all the blossoms from your fruit trees the first 3 years after planting, because you want the tree to focus its energy on the roots and vegetative growth and not on fruit growth. So that we recommend taking off all of the blossoms in that case. Yeah, some good questions. Anything else that is on people's minds here?
Yeah, great. And can you talk to, in terms of sun exposure, some of the berries again? I know you mentioned
Yeah.
honeyberries can actually do well in shady areas. I'm more or less assuming everything does well in sun.
Yeah, everything does well in sun. I think out of these berries, I think gooseberries and currants are kind of like the most sun loving and also really adaptable because they can also do part shade. But gooseberries and currants are also kind of tougher in terms of exposure.
What do you mean by that?
They
can handle more from
can handle more. Yeah, they can handle more
from a sun
exposure.
exposure. Okay.
And I find that they tend to bounce back more. They're just like a little bit of tougher plants. Although all the berries, honestly, the berries tend to generally be tougher than the fruit trees, and maybe because they're slightly less selected, less domesticated. A surprising one for me, actually, that I've seen more and more in terms of success rates in our food forests that don't need replanting is the aronia. The aronia is a berry that it's a larger shrub than the currants or the gooseberries, but it just seems to be like really fight through transplant shock well, and it likes water. It's native in riparian areas a lot of times, but even so, even without being near like a lake or a river, I've seen aronias be really impressive. That's a plant that's native more to the Midwest of North America. But yeah.
Yeah, that all makes sense. In terms of what does well in maybe part shade, are there any in here that jump out or you've seen do well?
Currants.
Current. Okay.
Currants do well in part shade, and elderberries can do all right as well. They don't grow as fast in part shade, but they're also kind of water loving, so they like it if it stays moist, more moist, and And so elderberries can do well, but they just get larger. But currants are awesome because we actually are planting them, 4 feet away from our fruit trees because they're going to bear for a while as it's full sun, and as the tree canopy fills in, they'll still be able to produce even in a little bit of shade.
Mhm.
So I kind of like currants and gooseberries as well, but currants, because the berries are smaller, they have a little bit more of an adaptable uh, habit, and so they're really good, like kind of forest edge plants.
Cool.
Yeah. Any
Um,
other
yeah,
particular?
I have
Yeah. Hi,
I have a
Julie. Yeah.
question. Hi. So, okay, so to get like this idea of companion planting, so you have like a a fruit tree, and then you have like the nitrogen fixers 3 to 4 feet away, and then like further away you have like the berry bushes.
Not
Or
necessarily. No, it's so it depends. I'll go to this diagram a little bit, and this it should be a little bit. I actually should update this with some more precise diagrams, but essentially, like, these smallest circles are actually things like elderberry, serviceberry, aronia that are quite large shrubs. What we actually do is, if this is a 15-foot circle, we're actually planting in. I would also plant our currants, honeyberries, gooseberries, yostaberries, those things also about 3 to 4 feet away from the tree, but just in a different part of the circle, in a different part of, a different radius. So we kind of plant in this circular pattern. If you're planting in a row, you can also do that. Just plant, so the berries don't need to be any farther away than the nitrogen fixers.
okay, gotcha. So I guess like as the tree grows, like certain habitats are going to get shaded out, like
Mhm.
right. And so they just kind of die off, and then you like plant like new
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like, again,
fixers
the currents, so the nitrogen fixers, by the time the tree is big enough to shade those out, the nitrogen fixers will kind of have done their job. They're sort of there in order to boost production or boost growth, but not to be there in the long term.
Okay.
So you kind of have these early succession plants, like that do in better sun, but then as it starts to fill in, I don't know, maybe in 10 years, then you plant uh the honeyberry under it. The first couple of years in a big exposed site, we've got our fruit trees, and we're putting in like some lead plant and false indigo and really trying to improve the soil. And then 10 years later, you've got a little bit of a canopy, and then you can add honeyberries in below, or you can put more other root crops like strawberries. Honestly, work really. They don't love full sun, so they are also a good kind of understory plant. So you would kind of adjust that over time, and maybe you dig your currant bush up and move it or propagate it. So yeah, I mean, we're talking on multiple decade scales a lot of times here.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I have another question later, but like whoever else has questions can ask too.
I think just keep going.
Okay. So this is my perennial question. Um, if we want to if we have existing like fruit trees and we want to like then create this like forest garden understory idea, like how does one begin with that? Like would you just like maybe start planting like a honey bush or like strawberries? Like
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of things that you could do for existing trees. I think I haven't listed all of them here. Let me just so like comfrey is a really good one for that, because it can kind of be an understory. So you can do comfrey, horseradish as well. You could kind of integrate those. Strawberries again, and honeyberry, like you mentioned. Also, daffodils are great on the edge of things, like daffodils and other bulbs, because they come up before the tree's fully leafed out. So they actually will like provide some early pollinator habitat and more diversity. And daffodils also discourage voles and burrowing rodents because they're toxic to them. So you can plant like a ring of daffodils around something, and then in April the daffodils are up and they're flowering, and then a month later the tree has leafed out, and then it shades it in. So that's a way to do it. I think also just existing trees, you can help to feed with lots of wood chip mulch,
Mhm.
and kind of smothering out other grass in competition. Another thing is edible mushrooms. You can get edible mushroom spawn that you put it that it's in sawdust. You can order that and then mix it into wood chip mulch. And then because you're watering the tree or watering that, then you can help to then sometimes you can get edible mushroom yields because they like part
Mm.
shade.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then Melissa asks in the chat, if you had to pick a good starter tree for beginners, is there something you'd pick? And then Shoshana, I see your hand in a moment. So starter tree, I don't think people should really plant peaches in Denver unless they really know they have the microclimate. I know it's very popular, but they struggle more in Denver than they do in the Western Slope. I honestly think that a fire blight resistant apple or pear is great because it's a known fruit and you know that you're going to use it. But then I also would say, if I'm really probably a pie cherry is the one that splits the difference in terms of having pretty reliable fruit, a little bit smaller, doesn't have as much disease pressure. That's something that can be pretty accessible as a starter tree. But also like plant a whole bunch of trees. Like I know there's cost barriers and there's things like that, but get bare root trees that are less expensive, get those in the spring and put in a bunch of trees because our timeline is like now right now and it takes a long time for them to get established. I would even say you can plant more densely with trees to start, and then you can take a tree out if it's not doing well. You can even transplant it at a later age if it's like, oh, this is doing well or this isn't. So I think I know the 15-foot spacing is what we do at our food forest, but I think it can be really helpful for learning and better practice to plant a lot and plant more densely than you think at the start. Thanks, Nick. So you can for Doug trees, if you go to our website at doug.org, let's see if I go doug.org and then you go to the thing in the bar that says shop, and then you'll have a menu that says, I think it just says bare root trees. I'm actually going to stop sharing now because then I can also look this up on the side. Oh, awesome. I'm glad there was a link in the meeting reminder, Melissa. Yeah, we're sold out of a few things. We're sold out of peaches, which people still love peaches. But we've got most other trees and we got a lot of the berries still left. Yeah. Oh yeah, Shoshana, you would raise your hand.
Hey, yeah, this one's pretty specific to me, I think, but I've been looking for wood chips and I'm specifically don't have a way to get them to deliver them to my house. So I'm curious if anyone knows any cheap ways to get wood chips at your house.
Have you
Yeah,
heard of chip drop? Um, I don't know if oh, that was in your background. I was like, did somebody else? If you go to chipdrop.in, that's a resource where local arborists who otherwise have to pay to recycle their wood chips can just drop a load. The problem is that you don't have a lot of control of the size of it. Sometimes it can be quite a lot. But it's free or it's like $20 for 20 yards. It could be a lot of wood chips and it's kind of locally harvested. That's the best one. But you can also Google arborists in your neighborhood or nearby and just call them and tell them. Like I think people think of it as like a couple steps, but call arborists and say, hey, I'd like this. If you're in the neighborhood, you can drop it by, and a lot of times they'll be fine with that as long as you have somewhere they can go, like a driveway or even put some cones out or something to mark out a spot on the street, and then you can just, as long as you move it within a few days, that's the best accessible option, I think.
Creighton, I've got a really specific question for you. I moved into a new house and inherited a pear tree, a peach tree, and an apple tree, and a beaver moved in the backyard and took out the peach tree and the pear tree. We still got the apple, But like, do fruit trees need specific, like, do they, this is probably a stupid question, but do they taste better than like other
Yes.
trees?
They
Okay.
do. They actually, yeah, that's a great, it is a specific question, but it's an interesting one. Yeah, I live pretty near to Barnum Park, which is on Weir Gulch, and the beavers have actually been devastating. They've been like really, the beavers have been moving in as some of the hydrology changes and maybe heals around here, but
Yeah.
that's a whole side question about ecology. But the beavers have like, they take down the crab apples first. And actually even certain, so rabbits and squirrels even will chew the cambium, the outer bark of fruit trees in late winter, because if they're starving and they can't get anything else, that's a source of nutrients. It's the same reason, like they're more domesticated, we're watering them, they're more succulent, so they actually do taste better. I know that I see parks like painting stuff on the trunks to keep the beavers from eating them, but I would actually recommend wrapping it in hardware cloth, or not just like chicken wire. Chicken wire is not strong enough.
Yeah.
You get the hardware cloth mesh and make a little ring around it, and not right next to it, but like stake it out, like around the trunk of the tree. I think that's the best thing that I've seen to protect from the beavers.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, bummer. I want to like them more, but they're actually like quite destructive to our hybrid urban landscape along waterways right now.
Yeah, I want to
Josh,
like them too until they took out 6 of my trees. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah. Josh, I think you were maybe about to ask a question, so I'm unmuting.
Oh no, chip drop is great. I
Oh,
think if you do want to make sure that you get chips, I think there's an option where you can tip, and that
Yeah,
usually
I think they have now gone to like, it's like you can do like 20, 40, $60, 80, and like the more you pay, the quicker you'll get them, depending on where you live. But
most of the time when I've done like $20,
Yeah.
I think great, and like you said too, there's been times I haven't even done that, but you also have to be prepared. Well, you can ask, you can be very specific if you want to have like big pieces of logs, or if
Yeah.
you just want chips.
Yeah, and chip drop is great because it takes the individual interaction out, but I've been amazed where we can, maybe because I'm calling from Denver Urban Gardens and saying it's for a garden, but I can just call an arborist and say, hey, you got any trucks? We got a place to dump. And my success rate with that has actually been honestly pretty good a lot of the time. So if chip drop is taking a long time, that's another option. Just call them directly.
Great. One of the things that we've been talking about, I mean, from most of the classes that I've taken from you, is soil amendments. Not necessarily soil amendments, but trying to build up soil, making the soil better wherever you go. And I guess I was wondering, especially with your not necessarily preference for native trees, have you seen anything? Is there anything interesting about the effect of adaptized trees to native trees?
No, I don't think there's nothing. I mean, certain plants will be more aggressive, and they can like block out certain other plants. But when we're talking about like adapted trees, they're not doing anything different to the soil. They're still improving it. I'll also say that like when we think about this, like this wood chips are adding lots of organic matter to the soil. They're suppressing weeds, but they're also adding a lot of organic matter, which is great for anything that produces food, but it's not great for a lot of our kind of like native dry land, like even like our like medicinal plants and things like sages or mountain mahogany, or like a lot of these things with like lots of essential oils and really fragrant aromatics and things like that. Salvias, things like that. A lot of those plants actually prefer a low organic matter content. So I like to think about our places, like we're going to plant our food in this area, and we're going to put a whole bunch of wood chips and a lot of organic matter because we want a whole bunch of food to come out of that, more fertility in, more food out. And then around that, we will also plant other things that are serving the native ecology, right? So that's kind of how I think about that dichotomy. But I haven't seen any particular interactions other than like sometimes newly introduced species have a hard time getting pollinated because the pollinators just don't recognize them yet. That can be an interesting thing. But anything on this list is adapted enough at this point.
I think one of the things that you've always like geeked me out on is is the grouping of plants that can have like a real effect on each other in real time. You know what I mean? What you've talked about with the
Yeah.
pea shrubs, right? Like letting those pea shrubs get to like 2 years old before you're cutting those back, because then there's that flush of nitrogen for
Mhm.
anything like kind of new growth that you have. So I guess that was more my question, is like, is there any observations about native plants interacting with the soil or other plants around it in such a way that it focused on a certain nutrient more than than adaptized. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, that's
That stuff just geeks me out.
that's yeah, that's a level of precision that is beyond my experience and kind of my aptitude or interest. Because a lot of times I'm just like, let's put a bunch of organic matter, put the plants in, and they'll work it out. But I'm sure that there's interesting stuff going on and interesting stuff to analyze in a deeper way about that. Yeah. Shoshana.
Yeah, I guess my last question is, as a real newbie and I'm sure a lifelong learner in this, what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes you see people make as they're trying to grow a fruit forest?
Um, okay, I guess not planting densely enough. In our climate, actually planting densely and putting lots of things in to start creates a more humid microclimate. So it's paradoxical, but planting more actually helps to keep the plants cycling water within each other better. Similarly, not putting enough mulch down. If you get wood chip mulch, great, but then people like put this little like inch layer and it doesn't actually do composting. Like put a foot down. Anywhere where you're not growing plants, put as much down as you can, and that's actually going to compost down faster and actually add things at a higher rate. There's no reason to ration it really, other than you don't want to bury your new plants in mulch, but anywhere in between, like lots of that, and also to put it farther out, like the roots of a tree will extend at often twice the diameter of the canopy. So if you're standing under a tree, the roots are like way far out. So you can actually be feeding those roots with a mulch circle that's far beyond the drip edge or the canopy of the tree. And then the last thing is I think variety selection. So people will, there are ornamental hazelnuts, for instance, that people will get in nurseries because filberts or hazelnuts they'll get, but they're not selected for production. And then they'll get like they'll wait 7 years and get two nuts and say, what is this? This was worthless. So making sure that you're choosing plants that are specifically geared towards food production, because there's a big difference in variety selection because there's been so much breeding and selection over generations and hundreds or if not thousands of years. So finding those little avenues and making sure that you're looking for that. And along with that, also like the disease resistance thing, certainly, particularly with fire blight in Denver. I just hear so many people talk about apples and pears like they don't work, and they're awesome. Like mine, not to brag, but like mine look great. And so there's no reason to shy away from those things as long as you're more aware of some of the dangers. Any last questions? Yeah, Jerry.
Okay. So do you have any arborists that you recommend for doing like summer fruit pruning? Because fruit tree
No,
pruning,
I
would you do it yourself?
no.
Even if they're really big. Okay.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I don't offer that as a service anymore. I used to do more pruning on the side. Through our food forestry program, we may have people soon who are able to do more of that work. The summer pruning or topping of trees to keep them smaller is specialized, needs to be done with sterilized tools. And if you ask an arborist who's familiar with fruit trees, and I don't know any of them that specialize in that, it's possible there are in Denver. I just still haven't heard of them. They will That's like a prime time to introduce fire blight and to really butcher the trees. So I especially would not recommend arborists for summer pruning of fruit trees.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
hopefully that's coming soon, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can sort of wrap up. I hope to see you at our plant sale this weekend. Feel free to reach out. I'm not always able to respond super quickly around this time of year, but hope to see you out and about in our food forests. Another great way to keep thinking about this is to visit one of them. If you go to doug.org/foodforest, or just navigate there from our main page, we've got a map of where they all are, and you can walk through them. We've got educational signage at many of them. Just kind of see how things are going at early stages in trees. So thank you all for your attention and for a lot of really great questions. It's been good having you here.
Thanks, Creighton.
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Sweet, great work.